Good afternoon. I'm really excited that I have the solutions panel because I tend to be an optimist, and just complaining all the time gets me down. So I'm glad to be on the solutions-oriented panel. We have a great panel. The speakers are seated in order that they are in the agenda, so you'll be able to keep track of them. I have Rob Johnson, Chris Miller, and Andy Purdy. The way we're going to start is I thought the speakers could just introduce themselves, give a little bit of background, give a little bit of what they're working on, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the discussion. So, Rob, I'll hand it over to you first to introduce yourself to the room.
Rob Johnson, grew up in Detroit, Michigan, studied economics and electrical engineering at MIT, PhD in economics from Princeton. Then I worked with the United States Senate Budget Committee on the Republican side, Senate Banking Committee on the Democratic side. Then I came back to New York, Bankers Trust, and years at Soros Fund Management. After a while, I left and, did some sailing, did some documentary films, but got really inspired when the great financial crisis happened and came back and co-founded with George Soros the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which I've been doing now for 13 and a half years. And it started there. That was the traumatic birth experience, but a lot of work in Asia, India, China, all kinds of things. And happy to be here today. I lived in Greenwich for 15 years, so it's nice to contribute to your energies, and thank you for including me.
It's amazing to hear that bipartisanship does in fact exist. We have real life proof on the stage, so that's good. You've seen something in this panel already. All right, Chris, how about you? What tell us about yourself and some of the things you're working on.
Well, thanks for the invitation to join today. I'm still looking forward to the sailing portion of my career. Sad to say that hasn't come yet. I'm a director at Greenmantle, which is a company that advises asset managers on geopolitics and macroeconomics. And I'm initially a Russia specialist by training, which meant that my past 6 months have been rather busy with issues that I'd rather not have been dealing with. But I'm also working on semiconductors, writing a book that'll be out this fall on semiconductor supply chains, which has brought me into a lot of the globalization and deglobalization issues that we'll be discussing today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Absolutely.
And last but not least, we have Mr. Purdy.
Thank you. Yeah, Andy Purdy. I'm Chief Security Officer for Huawei USA, 10 years in July, focusing on privacy and cybersecurity assurance within the U.S. I had a long legal career, including as a federal prosecutor, special counsel to the House Ethics Committee, counsel to the congressional investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. And then I left the law. I was also a network news producer for NBC and CBS for 5 years. I left the law to join the White House staff to be part of the team that wrote the U.S. National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace, and I led the U.S. government effort for cybersecurity from 2004 to 2006. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. When I read the title of this panel, I can't help but think about that ship last year that ran aground in the Suez Canal. Do you remember the Ever Given? One solution might just be to make the Suez Canal wider, but we won't be that simplistic this time. But I think about the last almost 3 years now of the pandemic and really how it exposed a lot of the weaknesses that we have in our current globalization system. Whether it's a global economy that kind of became accustomed to a stagnant demand for goods and really became over-reliant on just-in-time inventories, and then the real shift that happened during the pandemic in preference for consumer goods to durables and a lot of goods with high semiconductor content, and how that really jarred a lot of manufacturing systems and processing systems. And then, of course, something that's been brewing for a while, which is this tension between the kind of new era of global capitalism and national security preferences and political preferences, and how those things will kind of resolve themselves. But I guess where I want to start this discussion is in the physical world. We'll move into the digital world a little bit later, but in the physical world, I think one of the key issues is in semiconductors. So Chris, I just want to start with you and dig a little bit more into the research that you're doing for semiconductors to just illustrate how intricate those supply chains are, identify some of the issues, and then more importantly, focus on some things that either policymakers or producers or supply chain managers could be doing to help make those systems a little bit more reliable and a little bit more sustainable.
Well, I think one of the things that strikes me when we look at the global economy is how many Suez Canals there are in terms of choke points in every different industry that we often don't even realize exist. And when you go sector by sector and look at supply chains, you can find products that are sourced from just one or two companies, or goods that are sourced from one or two countries that, if things go wrong, for any number of reasons, from pandemics to politics, you can find your entire supply chain disrupted. And over the past couple of years, industry after industry has found their supply chains disrupted because they're reliant on choke points they didn't know existed. And they found out when it was too late, after their supplies arrived late or not at all. And the semiconductor industry is just, I think, one example of a supply chain complexity that many industries face, where there are a lot of these choke points. And it takes a lot of effort to actually understand where choke points exist. So if you look in the semiconductor space, from the design of a chip to its arrival in your iPhone, there are a series of different choke points in manufacturing processes and materials that even companies producing semiconductors don't even realize often the case, from specialized gases. Did you know that half of the world's neon gas comes from either Russia or Ukraine? Uh-oh. Whoops, we shouldn't have structured things that way. Did you know that every advanced processor chip relies on a machine from one company in the Netherlands? Now, thankfully, the Dutch are very reliable suppliers. However, that is not a resilient supply chain. And I think semiconductors are an area I've studied a lot, but they're not unique. In many parts of the economy are reliant on these choke points that we only think about their existence of until it's too late. And part of what we need to do is understand what are the choke points we haven't realized yet that are going to be a lot more important.
I mean, the one that I came across this year is a specific kind of trust that connects the second story of a house to the first story of a house. And one of the issues we have such a backlog of uncompleted homes in this country is because you couldn't get those specific trusses from a supplier in Turkey. So it could be some of the highest value add high tech manufacturing we have in semiconductors, or something that's been around for centuries.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think the Suez Canal analogy is useful as well, because infrastructure matters hugely. It's not just about can you produce the good, it's can you get it to where it needs to go. And so when we look at lots of commodities, the question is not only can you get the commodity produced, it's can you get it delivered. So for example, energy. Well, we're now focusing a lot on where do pipelines go exactly, because if you've got sanctions that cut off one country from its suppliers, that pipeline network matters a whole lot for, say, natural gas. Or food supplies right now in Ukraine. Ukraine used to ship its food all by sea through ports that are now blockaded. How quickly can you build grain silos on the Ukrainian-Polish border? Well, actually, it takes a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I'm wondering, and Rob, maybe you can chime in as well, is there a way to figure out where these choke points are before they become a problem, right? Like, it's almost like you think about it, it's almost like the analogy would be preventative healthcare and preventative medicine. Is there a way to be preventative in how we think about these supply chains and identifying these choke points? And what are some processes that people could go through to do that mapping?
Well, I think mapping is actually fairly straightforward. It's just time consuming, and most people aren't trained in thinking they have to do it. We become used to things just arriving via Amazon on our doorstep, pressing one click button. And looking through the supply chain of goods is really complicated. You have to understand not just one or two or four steps, but often 100 steps. And that requires a whole lot of research, and every product has a different supply chain. And so when you want to start mapping out choke points, there's a lot of different choke points to think about. And that's just a process that most of us don't feel the need to regularly do. But it's actually, I think, quite important in assessing risks. Yeah,
so it makes me wonder if that's why this issue of reshoring is becoming more prevalent. Is because if you don't want to go through all this effort in really mapping your supply chain, you might as well say, you know what, you throw in the towel and bring everything back onshore and just produce it either domestically or with countries that are very friendly and reliable. So for the U.S., it'd obviously be Canada and Mexico. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on kind of that reshoring process and how feasible reshoring some of these critical goods is.
Okay, well, I see this in the context of very long-term political economy. And as much as I've studied quantitative issues, I don't believe in what's called ergodic stability. I do not believe past is prologue very often. Talk to people in the insurance business these days about how they're going to create policies that relate to climate change. They have no idea what the actuarial table should look like. So
Thinking about all those condos in Miami that are just very hard to insure.
Got to wear big rubber boots now. But I guess when I came here, I heard the word solutions, and I thought single malt scotch. That's how we're going to anesthetize this stuff. But I often hear things in my mind through music. When I was a boy, my dad had a patient. His name was Marvin Gaye, and he wrote a song. He started with, "We got to find a way to bring some love in here today." And when he had gone through the argument, he said, "We got to find a way to bring some understanding here today." I believe the emotional context is what creates the basis for logical agreement. What I think the world is missing right now, and I'll point to my friend Orville Schell, who ran the US-China program for the Asia Society. He wrote a book called Wealth and Power with John Delury. And he said, there was a century of humiliation from the 1840s, the Opium Wars, to the Japanese invasion in the 1940s. And the Chinese, and you can read his book, it's very positive, it's very hopeful, want to get a seat back at the table. They don't want to dominate, they want to have a seat at the table. On the other side, you have the United States. We have this really beautiful protection of individual freedom kind of mode of thinking. But we were used to being the leader. And Orville, 10, 12 years ago, I've made videos with him about his forthcoming book, is talking to me in things that I didn't understand about how there is going to be a tectonic plate crash. Zbigniew Brzezinski gave a speech I attended in 2010 in Montreal, where he said, we moved to a G20, there are two philosophical systems that are going to be integrated, and they don't think the same way. Cartesian Enlightenment, Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist, whatever. They're going to project onto each other things that the other side isn't thinking. But he also said, after the great financial crisis, which was a globally propagated thing, everybody knows that politics matter. But as my friend Joseph Stiglitz once said to me, is the Treaty of Westphalia dead? Meaning you don't have the levers and controls anymore. So when we come to things like alleviating supply chain problems, building resilience, what I'm getting at from my opening here is people didn't see it coming. I believe they will adapt. One of the things that scares me is when people get afraid, they become what you might call vulnerable to authoritarianism. I'll come and put out your fire. But that dogmatism, we kind of saw that with Stalin and Lenin and a little bit of Mao. I think the people who value the vitality of markets really need to come to the table now with proactive governance. I'll give you an example. Stephen and I were talking, and it triggered an episode in my life recently. I was talking about climate-related issues. And a gentleman from West Virginia said, you grew up in Detroit. Look how they trashed you guys. First the Japanese come in, then machine learning, automation. There was no transformational assistant. I'm not going to be a good guy. And I said, where do you get this Detroit vis-a-vis what you're doing? He says, my dad had a brother. He thought Detroit was an exciting place. They ran a coal business together. Brother split off, went and made a lot of money, then lost it all and took his own life. He didn't feel like he was part of America. They just let him flush. I think ex-ante transformational assistance, which particularly is involved in reinvigorating the education system, teaching all those physical workers how to do digital related work or engineering, gives them a feeling. I'm going to send you all to Peter Goodman, writes for the New York Times. He's got a paper from, I think it's 2017, called We Love the Robots. And it was about how America is not doing transformational assistance. And in the old days, we all said, Europe's sclerotic. Europe can't get it going. America can reshuffle the supply side resources and go to a higher level. But he said, now you guys are getting so frightened in resistance that your politics is breaking down. And in Sweden say, we love the robots because we're all going to have our health care. our children's education and our pension. We just got to learn a new job, and they'll help us do that. That's a smaller country. It's a different problem. But right now, supply chain adjustment makes sense because inflation is exacerbating fear. We got to find a way to bring some love in here today. That's a good first step. But in the medium term, we got to find a balance where we don't worship dogmatic or authoritative governance, but we build it into the blend a lot more than we've tolerated in recent years.
Right, and I mean, I think, you know, some of the things that I tease, or one thought I had is that to get away from the status quo, everyone's going to have to give up a little bit of something, right? The multinational platform company is going to have to give up a little bit of profit margin to make the system a little bit more resilient. Consumers might have to be able to tolerate a little bit higher inflation, a little bit higher prices for consumer goods, but in the end, we probably get to a more sustainable equilibrium. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's one other dimension. I brought up this U.S.-China tectonic plates thing. I want to turn you all on to a book that's free. It's called 21st Century Asia by Kishore Mahbubani. Born in India, lived in Singapore, still lives in Singapore, has worked with the UN a great deal. And he has a chapter where he says, it would be nice if the world wanted to emulate America. There's so many beautiful things about America. But he said, they're starting to view it as a plutocracy. They're starting to view it as ill because it has such big prison systems. And he said, we've got to recognize that for America to be a leader, it really has to lead. And it haunted me because I ran a conference at Beijing University in 2018 about the development of Africa. And all the Americans were very skeptical about Chinese role in Africa. The Chinese were talking about this movie, Wolf Warrior 2, which was a reaction to Western colonialization. But I see at this juncture, you have to not allow, and now I'm coming right to the core of the matter, not allow the military-industrial complex to demonize others in order to goose their budget. We have to take political economy back from donors. We've got to reduce the role of money at universities, in the media, and particularly vis-a-vis politicians. There should be public budgets made for set-aside time on television and radio so nobody has to raise that much money. Then the politicians are going to have much trimmer budgets because they're not going to have to sell policy to survive. But right now, I was on a panel last night with the Quincy Foundation, and the idea of the military-industrial complex putting us all at risk with our health, like the movie The Day After from 1983, is just not tolerable. And I see that pervasive in the political economy of the financial sector, of the fossil fuel sector, of many others. We got to find a balance, and I don't want it to, through despair, become authoritarian government. I've got 2 little children, 3 grandchildren. I do not want them to grow up in an authoritarian place, and I fear that's the trajectory we're on.
Well, you're a busy man with those panels, so we're happy to have you this afternoon as well. You know, Andy, I do want to bring you into the conversation though, just because you know, you do have a really interesting vantage point of some of these issues, and maybe, you know, obviously going back to the kind of semiconductor issues. Another angle to give this though is, you know, obviously the joke I made at the beginning was the Ever Given running aground. A lot of us think about this, the globalization and supply chains in terms of the physical world, but there's also a burgeoning digital global economy that is much more dynamic, much faster moving, and has a much less established or even consistent set of rules. So I'm wondering from your perspective and your vantage point, what are some of the issues facing that ecosystem, and what are some of the potential solutions to help govern a more reliable framework there?
I mean, first I was struck by the reference to the Marvin Gaye song I should have paid more attention to. In my impressionistic years, the Marvin Gaye song that I couldn't get out of my head was Let's Get It On. So both in the physical, in fact, it still rings in my head. The physical world and the digital world. I think it's important that we remember we need a rules-based international order. And I know the administration is pushing for that. Sometimes it's hard because of the politicization of issues between countries gets so great that it makes it hard for people, whether digital or physical, to focus on, as Damien said earlier, what's in the best interest of the United States. Somebody like Peter Thiel, the billionaire, would say, don't buy from China, don't sell from China. But you see recent editorials in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal on the issue of should there be legislative exceptions to tariffs on Chinese goods. And even the Wall Street Journal editorial criticizing a number of Republican members of Congress, including some who they said had switched opposing the exceptions because of pressure from the Trump wing of the party, basically saying when American companies can't buy the products from anyone else, why would we have that additional 25% cost? Let's think about it in terms of what's in the best interest of the United States. And so I'm reminded that as you look at supply chain, the issue of resilience, which is in the physical as well as the digital world, an official of the European Bank on Development and Reconstruction said there's a danger that we will impose trade barriers in the name of resilience. And the issue of trade barriers in the name of national security in the digital space is very, very important. What we're seeing with the cyber attacks the last couple of years, particularly SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange server, to some extent Colonial Pipeline, we are seeing a recognition, growing recognition, that we need to improve the defenses of American government, American critical infrastructure, and that traditional notions of trusted suppliers don't work anymore. The bad guys can hack into everybody, so you can't put your guard down on anybody's products. And frankly, I think you've got to be a little more truthful about what the situation is. The questions about whether a particular company is sending data back to whoever, the allegations recently against Nokia, that they were accusing Nokia of what they accused Huawei of sending data back, sucked up and sending it back to the Chinese surveillance engine. Well, if there's any evidence that a telecom equipment supplier, Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson, whoever, has the ability to do, and Nokia said they don't have the ability to do it, we know we don't have the ability to do it. If the government knows that telecom equipment suppliers have the ability to do this malicious activity, they've got to speak up, and we've got to improve the defenses for everybody. So now that we see that no such thing as trusted suppliers, that's part of the movement you saw referenced, didn't begin there, in President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity a year ago, where he mentioned the importance of zero trust, that you can't trust anybody. And you have to have an ability to make sure, rather than a perimeter-based defense, a perimeter-less defense, where you have to continually validate, authenticate the user, the device, the purpose, the access, and you have to assume that the bad guys are going to get in. So you have to segment your networks, and you have to increase your ability to monitor and increase information sharing, so that when there's concerning activity that may not look that serious, you want to make sure you share with the CERT community. You want to make sure you share with the government so that the dots can be connected, and we have a better ability to know whether we have to do more things. And frankly, one more part of it is, as part of a rules-based order, and hopefully the United States will get involved in this, that the activities involved in the international standards efforts, in the efforts to develop an ability to have conformance and independent testing of everybody's critical components, that's essential. And we need to open up the kimono. I've got to think of a better analogy, being, Chinese, the U.S. version of a Chinese company, in terms of how can we be more transparent so there's an ability to tell whether companies, whether it's WeChat, TikTok apps, or us, and the Tesla CEO mentioned this as well, we have to know what's the status of the data, who's got the data, how's it protected, what are you doing, and we as a country need to have, if not national privacy legislation, our private sector needs to step up and say, we have to create an ability to audit for cybersecurity and privacy before really bad things happen.
I'm reminded of another now Motown song, Nowhere to Run, Nowhere to Hide, by Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. In 2015, I'm really underscoring what you just said. In 2015, I had a meeting with very high-level people in the Chinese government. And my question for that meeting was, you've got national security and we have digital platforms. And it doesn't feel like we can achieve cybersecurity and therefore share in these platforms. And at that time, we both agreed that America was a little further down the curve and could build these things, but they couldn't trust them. And I said, well, why can't you trust them? And he looked at me and he said, Rob, you could be in Winnipeg and you could hack into my systems and place your location as Washington, D.C., and make it look like Washington was coming after Beijing. He said, you could be in Armenia and you could pretend you were in Shanghai hacking a bank in New York. We don't even have the ability to know once we make an agreement that we're both abiding by it, because these third-party hackers can disguise who they are and where they are. So they didn't have an idea at that time, and they were kind of asking me to take it home. I never came up with a way out. I saw this was kind of it maybe still is an intractable frontier, but it's an important one.
I guess Andy doesn't have an answer for that either.
I mean, I agree, and frankly, the capabilities of promoting, particularly the private sector dialogue, the track 2 dialogue between the U.S. and China, trying to find areas of common ground. We saw the remarks last year by Catherine Tai, the trade rep. We saw the remarks by the Secretary of State a week or two ago, that we have to continually try to find common ground, and we have to continually increase the ability to have a rules-based order, challenges about free trade, forced technology transfer. These things we have to continue to work on because we have to raise the bar. It's going to benefit everybody. And we also have to, have greater transparency and accountability. I'm recommending that we create mutual trust agreements where governments sign agreements with other governments holding themselves liable, and the companies in those countries sign agreements with those governments that they promise that they're not going to do bad things, and perhaps they would face punishment levels like the European Privacy Directive, 4% of gross revenues. Because we're just like we can't have a global 15% tax, we're not going to have binding cyber norms in our lifetime. But let's come up with other ways that we can promote accountability. I made an offer to the now Deputy National Security Advisor, Ann Neuberger, 2 years ago at the NSA when she was head of cybersecurity at NSA. I said, would NSA be willing to come into Huawei facilities and check out what we do and how we do it? Because transparency is essential. Transparency for everyone. We have to have those dialogues so that we can improve the ability to be transparent, improve the ability to do the kind of thing that you're talking about, so we know that the rules are being enforced and there's going to be accountability for violations.
One of the, I think, the difficulties of this issue is that if you envision a world economy with choke points, even if whoever owns the Suez Canal promises they're always going to let you through, you're never really sure if that's true. Now, the Suez Canal, you can sail around Africa, slightly more costly, slightly more time consuming, but the question is always who's in charge of the choke points. And I think what we've seen over the past 3 decades is that alongside the concern about globalization from multiple different directions has been the realization that global politics is a lot less consensual than we thought. There's a lot more jockeying for power and therefore jockeying for control over choke points because they're very, very valuable. And we've seen this throughout history of, in the past, it was the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal that were the most valuable choke points. Now they're in the tech sector. These are the choke points you really want to get a hold of if you're a country. And we've seen country after country try to use the choke points it's got for political purposes, whether it's Japan and Korea in their refusal to sell certain types of specialized gases to their industry, or it's the U.S. using its control over semiconductors, or Russia now refusing to sell noble gases to U.S. industry. Everyone who's got a choke point almost invariably tries to use it for geopolitical purposes, and that's something that's very, very hard to get around.
Yeah, and it reminds me of the last panel, the discussion around demographics and geography being the most important and tractable things. And I think the choke points certainly fits into geography. To that point, and this might be a more specific question that I have a personal interest in, but there's been a lot of announcements from semiconductor companies about investing in production capacity in the United States, in Arizona. In your view, is that enough to move the needle to make the semiconductor supply chain a little bit more equitable in terms of where the choke points are, or is it just a very small first step in a much larger process?
Well, I think in this sense, the semiconductor industry is representative in many ways, a lot of industries where reshoring can solve certain issues, but it doesn't make you totally independent of global trends because you've still got a supply chain process with 2,000 different inputs when you add up the entire process from materials to end. So if you're manufacturing in the US, that's great, but you still need to get all of the materials, all of the machinery, all the intellectual property, which still come from countries the world over. So I think, yes, it's a good thing the US is manufacturing or planning to manufacture more onshore, but the idea that this is going to insulate us from global trends, well, that's just a myth.
Okay. I'll open it up there to questions from the audience, and I already see one in the front row. Do we have mics in the room, or do I have to give up? We'll just get you a mic.
The point I'd like to make is the panel focused on solutions when globalization runs aground. That's a reactive approach. What are we doing to proactively assess something occurring before it happens so we can prevent it, which is the smarter move in my mind. So supply chain issues. Who's anticipating? What organization is analyzing the possibility of a supply chain problem addressing the globalization and proactively prevent the problem so that you don't end up with consequences that could be avoided?
I guess I would say if I believed that human beings were prescient enough to achieve that, I'd be a lot more comfortable right now. I'll refer you to a book by Mary Douglas. It's called Risk and Culture. And it's all about the difficulties in an uncertain and changing world of getting ahead of that curve. Occasionally there are people, but often the person that's way ahead of the curve is viewed as crazy. And it's only in retrospect that they come back and recognize their brilliance, but maybe we missed the opportunity.
I would set up an international organization that would analyze information the same way the FBI and other other police organizations from various countries combine information to determine what's happening. And that organization would be proactive and advise the countries or the companies in those countries that that's an example of an approach that I would think of.
I think this is a role that Homeland Security has an important role in, as I'm sure you know, that they've done an awful lot of work, for example, on the GPS network to make sure that that's going to be up and running. They're supposed to be doing a lot on anticipating for pandemics. That's one of the challenges. They were supposed to be, when they were formed, and I was there in the early days of Homeland Security, the idea was to go for a risk-based approach, not a threat-based approach. You don't wait till you know they're learning how to fly airplanes into buildings before you do something about it. And that's why I think there's also the role of the private sector. You talk about proactive. I think the private sector needs to play a much greater role on a number of these issues, frankly, on the whole competition with China, the technology innovation competition. We should have a private sector-led technology innovation plan to drive forward, because I want us to continue to grow our lead. It's not in everything. Continue to grow our advantage over China in technology innovation. And you talk about, we've got to learn lessons from the globalization. All these people lost their jobs, and what did we do? Nothing. All those people who were in bad times in the pandemic because they had lower jobs and they couldn't work from home. What have we done? We have to train our people and educate the underskilled and undereducated. And we need a future of work strategy led by the private sector. And pardon me if I sound like I have a strong opinion, because I do, that if we want to lead into the fourth industrial revolution, the intelligent world, we have to train our people to be leaders, educate, training, our the technical people we need to move forward to 5G and 6G. And frankly, in the R&D space, we have to be willing to collaborate to great companies like Huawei, where we're working on not just, trying to innovate and come up with apps. We're looking at what is the technology necessary for 5G and 6G. We estimate that the connectivity has to grow 100-fold every 10 years. So we have to do work, and we're open to it, and we're doing it on things like Moore's Law and Shannon's Limit. And nobody from the U.S. ever comes and say, well, you say you're willing to cooperate. Let's talk, let's share, let's make progress as a global community together. What really amazes me in 10 years at Huawei, nobody has ever come in to take us up on our offer to share information about digitalization. I was at a conference in Austin a couple weeks ago, the 5G Summit, where they're basically saying a lot of 5G-enabled technologies won't be realized till 6G. Well, if the U.S. would get its act in gear, we could have the benefit of those technologies a whole lot sooner. Not necessarily from us, but what is possible? It's like why we don't have high-speed trains in the United States. We have to be proactive, we have to think strategic, and we have to decide we want to continue to lead the world for all the reasons that we think are so important.
I mean, it also, to your point on information sharing and transparency, I mean, it seems like everyone kind of built up globalization in silos, right? And kind of making those silos a little bit more clear will help identify some of those choke points, some of those potential problem spots. But it seems like that might be a good first step. Any other questions or yes? Right here in the gray.
Yeah, I have a. Can you hear me? Yeah, I have a comment about that. I mean, I totally agree with Andy, and you guys talk about the collaboration and make it transparent. The only thing I've been in the States. I mean, I came from China, and a lot of years I studied in NYU, and now I'm in the States for 30-some years. I mean, I have a technology background, but my understanding is that there's something need to be like U.S. here need to be more like either transparent or maybe rule-based or fact-based the kind of ideology instead of the political or maybe like adversary, that attitude, so that everybody can cooperate together, right? So let's say if something that say if somebody say the chips are developed or maybe the communication equipment developed by Huawei has some issues, where the issues are, right? Where are the issues? So you should find the facts, and it's just like in the Iraq War, right? Say mass destruction of weapons, those kind of things. So it needs to be fact-based. So I don't know how the government here, right? So I'm a U.S. citizen too. So how the government here has to, based on the facts, not based on the others. How can we change that? That might be hard to do, I guess. I don't know. Do you have any comments about this?
I had the good fortune of being one of the parents to travel with the 4th grade down to the China Museum on Lafayette Street. And as I was listening to you, I was seeing all these pictures in the history of Chinese and Asian people coming to the United States. And all of in retrospect, it's not funny, but it's absurd. All of the misunderstandings that happened at each phase, and even how like vaudeville actors and actresses played into this. But I thought the children could see how absurd it was. And I think we not only want to talk at the level of government, we want to make sure the people that evolve into college and into government 10, 12 years from now or 20 years from now have what you might call understood how you can get way off course to help them, how you say, find their North Star for this kind of collaboration. As you know, America hasn't handled its relationship to African American people very well either, and that's causing a great deal of turmoil, and it has to be repaired. But not, how would I say, not understanding our culpability in the United States for the misunderstandings, the fear it engenders, and the overreactions, I think is the responsibility at the level of education.
Just right here in the front row of the microphone.
Thank you so much. My name is Karine. This is for Chris. Chris, right? Okay, yeah. With what we see happening now in Odessa and what you spoke often about with semiconductors, I'm wondering, in the same way that we think about valuation for companies, right? What do you think, if this work has, under the guise that this work has not already been done, if it has, you could let me know, and what that revealed. In the same way that we think about valuation for companies, what do you think it would reveal if we thought about valuation or reevaluation of countries in the context of resources held and chokeholds, right, that you mentioned, and what do you think that would reveal? And how do you think that might compare to the perspectives we have now about who's really, who really has the power, right? As we think about the president is getting ready to meet with, touch point again with Saudi Arabia. And what does that say? I mean, why are we there? Look at all that we said, but now it's a different conversation because I need something, right? Or that's what a lot of people are saying. So I guess I'm just thinking about, what do you think an evaluation of countries might reveal with that context?
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic question. And I think it points to the fact that we value things assuming everything will be okay with the choke points that we rely on. We value goods and companies assuming the Suez Canal will remain open, and when it doesn't, we revalue. And that's not the best way to do valuations. Just give you an example from the Russia-Ukraine war. American companies already in what they've marked to market have admitted $59 billion worth of losses. More are coming of things that have not yet been marked. So that's a meaningful misvaluation from where things stood in February, just for U.S. companies in a small market for U.S. companies. For countries as a whole, we'll look at Europe. Europe imported almost all of its energy, most of its gas, most of its oil from a country that it now treats as a geopolitical adversary and is now trying to cut itself off from both oil and eventually gas deliveries from Russia at enormous cost to itself. We can debate what the cost will be. 0.5% of GDP, 2% of GDP, it's large. And everyone is in the process slowly, painfully, of estimating down their German and Eurozone growth projections this year. And it's going to happen next year as well, as we find out that gas supplies this winter are far from guaranteed. It could well be cut off. And that's true not just for Germany, it's true from Italy, it's true for the rest of the Eurozone. It'll be a cold winter in Germany without any Russian gas. Not that it's guaranteed, but that the risk of that is substantial. And that was the risk that most people priced at approximately zero 3 months ago. So I think you're absolutely right that both for firms and for our macro projections for countries, if we assume all of the choke points will remain like the Suez Canal on normal days, that's going to lead to financial models that are wildly off base. And I think if we can identify the choke points that are most likely to go wrong, which actually is not impossible to do, and identify the ones that are most likely to have a big impact on firms, on commodities, on countries, that'll go a long way to accurately pricing the risk we ought to be pricing.
And we promise not to make this an inflation conversation, but I can't help but wonder about what the impacts on inflation might be if we do continue to see kind of restrictions to choke points. I think there was one more question in the back of the room, and then.
So the complex geopolitical situation between the U.S. and the Chinese government has incrementally led to what some colleagues and I have been describing as parallel tech stacks, right? As you have duplicative services, cloud services, et cetera. What does it take to reverse that? Because the trend we're on appears to be one where we're going to have dual and distinct and separate tech stacks with parallel innovation, which is inefficient, How do we reverse that? Should we reverse that? What does it take?
Well, I think it would take major political change in one party or both to do that. The problem with parallel tech stacks is that it is inefficient. The benefit is that neither side feels reliant on a choke point somebody else controls. And that's the dynamic that is pushing towards parallel tech stacks. US and China being the primary examples, but Europe and other countries also have their own initiatives underway. And it's an understandable, rational, to a certain extent, impetus if you don't control the choke point yourself and if you don't trust whoever does. So I think unless you get to a situation where you can either structure trust, which is really, really hard, or you get political changes that you find palatable, then it's going to be very difficult to reverse that trend, despite the costs.
That doesn't sound very optimistic.
It's not disinflationary.
Andy, did you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, I think the administration is right by wanting to try to pursue discussions to find areas of common ground. And as an example, in the semiconductors, not many will recall that when the U.S. government was going to ramp up the limitations on the ability of American companies to sell non-sensitive technology to Huawei and others, when they were going to move from the entity list up to the foreign direct product rule, amazingly, both the Department of Defense and the Treasury Department interposed an objection against escalating those limitations. And what they said was quite astounding in a toxic political environment. They said that essentially they were saying it's not a national security threat to sell that stuff to Huawei. And they said that it's very important that we not have more limitations because the revenues, and it was about $12 billion a year there, representing about 40,000 direct American jobs, this would have a terrible financial impact on the American companies. It would hurt the American companies' ability to function. It would hurt their ability to do research and development, and it would hurt the American companies' ability to support the U.S. defense industrial base. So Defense and Treasury was saying, and so if folks can think about things in that sense, and there are areas of mutual agreement that can be structured and that there can be limitations and consequences for violations, those are the kinds of things that I think need to be pursued.
Go ahead.
I've got a question for all of you that comes from recent experience. I recently had a very exciting podcast with an old friend, Alan Murray, former reporter who's now at Fortune. And he's got a new book coming out. And it was very optimistic about what you might call the world of ESG. I'm concerned about what you might call the reinvigoration of trust. I've talked with Richard Edelman, who does a lot of work for the World Economic Forum and others, and he has essentially said to me, there's very little trust in academic experts, there's very little trust in governance, but there's a great deal, there's some pretty good amount of trust in the military, but there's a lot of trust in the private sector. The private sector is measured by its results. But at some level, and this is why I use the phrase the ESG to come in here, picking up this bigger agenda, leading like Stephen is talking about, and taking the initiative can enhance their reputation. So if you have a big consumer market or broad-based stockholders, you might be happy with just the goodwill that you create. But are there ways to assemble the people who have the most residual trust and move it forward? I personally was very inspired that you did this conference, because instead of being despondent and having that scotch as your solution, y'all came to the table. This is the beginning. If you guys stay with this, if the private sector leads, I think we're going to sing Van Morrison's song, "The Healing Has Begun."
That's it. That's a great way to end. I love ending on a high optimistic note. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for coming.